When you think about the Soviet Union in World War II, what comes to mind? Probably massive battles, incredible sacrifice, the final victory in Berlin, right? Well, what if I told you that the story we all know is just the beginning? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the strange, the suppressed, and the truly unbelievable realities of what they called the Great Patriotic War. So let's kick things off with a real head-scratcher. For almost 20 years after winning the most brutal war in human history, the Soviet Union didn't really celebrate Victory Day. I mean, it wasn't a public holiday. People just went to work. Now, this isn't just a weird piece of trivia. It's a huge clue that the reality after the war was way more complicated than we've been led to believe. So yeah, let's dive right into that. This first part is all about how the Soviet state basically tried to bury the memory of the very event that defined it, how they told an entire nation to forget its greatest and most painful victory. I mean, just look at this timeline. It's bizarre. You've got the huge parade in 1945, and then just 3 years later, poof, Victory Day is a regular working day. And get this, the Soviet Union was technically still at war with Germany for a whole decade after the fighting stopped. They only formally ended it in 1955. It wasn't until 1965, a full 20 years later, that Victory Day became the big deal we think of today. You just have to ask, why? And this wasn't some subtle hint. Nope. The state issued a direct order, an actual directive that said, forget the Great Patriotic War and apply all efforts to rebuilding. Can you even imagine that? You survive a conflict that tore apart every single family, and then the government tells you to just forget about it? It was a stunning command, probably driven by a need to control the story, maybe a fear of war heroes becoming too popular, and of course, to get everyone focused on the massive job of reconstruction. Okay, so this idea of burying the memory connects right into one of the most painful parts of the war, the human cost. For the Soviet government, the number of casualties wasn't just a number, it was a state secret. And that official number? It changed a lot, depending on who was in charge. So right after the war, Stalin himself announced the official number of Soviet losses, 7 million. It was, a politically useful number. It was big enough to show the immense sacrifice, but maybe not so high that it would make his leadership look incompetent. But even back then, a lot of people outside the USSR thought, no way, the true cost has to be higher. And then, everything changed. After Stalin died, Nikita Khrushchev came to power and started his campaign of de-Stalinization, tearing down the old myths. And one of the first things to change was the death toll. Suddenly, the official number just exploded, nearly tripling to a shocking figure of over 20 million. But it didn't stop there. Fast forward to the late 1980s, when the Soviet Union was starting to open up a bit under Gorbachev. Historians finally got to dig into the archives, and the number went up again. The modern estimate is now over 26 million people. The sheer scale of that loss is almost impossible to wrap your head around. So you see, the point here isn't just about getting the math right. The way this number kept changing tells its own story, a story of political control, of censorship, and a decades-long struggle to even begin to understand the horrifying true scale of the war. And even today, experts are still debating the exact figures. Now, beyond all the politics and the mind-boggling statistics were the actual people, and believe it or not, animals on the ground. That classic image of the male Red Army soldier, it really doesn't tell the whole story. There were entire armies of unconventional soldiers who played a massive role, and their stories are rarely told. Let's start with this. The scale of female mobilization was just staggering. Up to 1 million women served in the Soviet armed forces. And let's be absolutely clear, we're not just talking about nurses or clerks. This was a full-on draft for frontline combat duty, on a scale that no other country even came close to. I mean, they served in basically every combat role you can think of. The Soviets had entire all-female fighter pilot regiments. The Germans were so terrified of their silent nighttime bombing raids, they nicknamed them the Night Witches. They had special schools just for training female snipers who became absolute legends. In the end, 87 women earned the highest possible honor, Hero of the Soviet Union. But women weren't the only unexpected soldiers fighting for the Soviets. Get this, more than 60,000 dogs were also officially enlisted in the Red Army, each one trained for a whole range of critical military jobs. And these were not just mascots, not by a long shot. These dogs were a crucial part of the war machine. You had messenger dogs that ran almost 200,000 combat reports right through the middle of battles. You had medic dogs that dragged 700,000 wounded soldiers to safety. They found over 4 million mines, saving who knows how many lives. And then, in a really grim example of wartime innovation, some were even trained as anti-tank weapons, sacrificing themselves to take out over 300 enemy tanks and armored vehicles. All right, for our last section, we're going to do a quick, rapid-fire round of some of the most bizarre, unbelievable facts from the Eastern Front. These are the kinds of details that just prove that truth is almost always stranger than fiction. First up, performance-enhancing drugs. German soldiers, especially their tank crews and pilots, were officially issued something called Pervitin. It was a powerful stimulant based on methamphetamine. It was literally handed out with their rations to keep them awake and fighting for days at a time. Okay, next up is a story that might be sitting in your fridge right now. When the war started, the German Coca-Cola factory was cut off from its syrup supply in the US. So the guy in charge had to get creative. He whipped up a new drink using whatever he could find, things like apple scraps and whey. He called it Fanta, from the German word for imagination, fantasy. And just like that, a global brand was born out of wartime necessity. And for our final and maybe most bizarre fact of all, who do you think Adolf Hitler considered his personal enemy #1? You think Stalin, right? Nope. It was a guy named Yuri Levitan. He was the main radio announcer for Radio Moscow. Hitler hated the hope that Levitan's powerful voice gave to the Soviet people so much that he declared him a personal enemy and put a bounty of 250,000 Reichsmarks on his head. So when you put it all together, from a victory that was forgotten on purpose to a death toll that kept changing, to the incredible stories of women and dogs on the front lines, it's clear that the history of the Great Patriotic War is so much deeper and stranger than we're usually told. It really makes you wonder, if all of this was hidden in plain sight about one of the biggest events in history, what other amazing stories are still out there, just waiting to be told?